Psychedelic compounds have been used for thousands of years. Of all the psychedelics available, magic mushrooms are some of the most well-known. We're going to start a new series on these very interesting fungi. And in this first installment, we're going to focus in on psilocybin, the compound that brings the magic to these mushrooms. And that's the topic of today's discussion. So these mushrooms belong to a genus of mushroom called the psilocybes. Now, another way to understand genus is that the genus Panthera refers to lions, jaguars, and the like. The magic to these mushrooms comes from compounds that we're familiar with, like psilocybin, and maybe a compound we're not familiar with, psilocin. And we're going to talk about the difference between these two. Now, these compounds bring the psychedelic effects and the hallucinogenic effects and things like that. They've been consumed for thousands of years, as I mentioned earlier, along with a lot of other psychedelics. They have recorded use in Mexico, Central and South America, and a 16th century Spanish priest first made record of their use by the Aztecs. Although the Catholic Church tried to stamp out almost any evidence of these mushrooms being used, they couldn't stamp out all of it, which is why we know some of this history. One other little fact is when these mushrooms are bruised, they usually will turn blue. Just something small I wanted to mention. So let's continue in our discussion. So in some of my videos, I mentioned that compounds belong in families. Now, the family that these compounds of interest belong to are the tryptamines. But there are other family members, like some neurotransmitters, serotonin, we're familiar with, melatonin, and others. And we know compounds like serotonin help balance and stabilize things like mood, sleep, and all sorts of other things. And we know compounds like melatonin help promote sleep and keep our sleep rhythm in balance. At the same time, other members of this family are psychedelics. An important piece I want to mention is the structure. All of these compounds have a very similar structure. And when it comes to compound structure, often dictates function. I wanted to mention this here because as we continue through this video, I'm going to show you guys how the way these molecules are shaped relates to the function they produce in our bodies. So let's list some of these psychedelics. We have psilocin, psilocybin, we have LSD, which some of us are familiar with. We have DMT, and this is the principal ingredient in ayahuasca, the psychedelic brew historically used in the Amazon, and 5-methoxy or 5-MeO-DMT, which comes from toads. And I'll make a video on ayahuasca and things like that, DMT, because that's a whole nother discussion. But I say all that to say that the tryptamine family is very diverse. Some of these compounds exist naturally in our body, some of them don't, but they all play an intriguing role in our psychology, whether they come from inside or outside. So let's dive a little deeper into psilocybin. Psilocybin is known as a prodrug. So what is a prodrug? I've mentioned prodrugs before, but prodrugs are compounds that turn into the active form when it's metabolized. Another word for metabolized is broken down. So what am I talking about? Well, everything starts with psilocybin, this thing right here. Well, it turns out that when psilocybin is broken down, it's converted into psilocin. Now, this conversion happens in the stomach, mainly the liver. Now, why is this important? Well, psilocybin is inactive. This compound by itself does not produce a psychedelic experience. What produces a psychedelic experience is psilocin, which means this process taking place in the stomach and liver is the most important part of this whole discussion. So let's talk about some other prodrugs to kind of put this into context. A video last year, I don't know when I made it, sometime early last year, was on lean, right? This pretty popular drug, codeine with promethazine. Well, turns out that codeine is inactive. What happens is that when it's converted, when it's metabolized, it turns into morphine, which produces the opioid-like effects as an opioid. Well, it also turns out that heroin will convert into morphine because both of these are prodrugs. That's just another example of a prodrug. But now we understand the importance of psilocin. So let's keep going in our discussion. So I just mentioned that psilocybin goes through this little process as it's consumed. This is a process many substances go through called the first pass effect. This is a very complicated biochemical process. But what happens is that as it moves through the stomach and liver, this thing, ALP, this enzyme, breaks this stuff down very rapidly. And when this happens, we get psilocin. Now, I have psilocin and serotonin here because I want to show you some differences. I said that the tryptamines have a very similar structure. Well, when it comes to these compounds, the only differences are this piece and this piece. That's it. This is important because structure, I mentioned this, dictates function. Because these things happen to connect to the same receptors, and they are structurally similar. You can consider this stuff like a hand in a glove. Although there are some differences, the main piece will fit in there and cause some interesting effects down the road. In this set of receptors are called the 5-HT receptors. 5-HT being another term for serotonin. Now, there are many of these receptors. Some of them are the ones involved in the psychedelics. There's all sorts of other compounds that combine with these, but these particular ones are important for this discussion. So let's very briefly discuss first pass metabolism. I mentioned this is a very, very complex process. I can make a whole series of videos just on first pass metabolism, but why is this important? Well, it turns out that when we consume a substance, well, it's a drug or whatever, our body doesn't need all of it. So the goal is for us to go from a high concentration to a low concentration via the liver. The liver is pretty much the great filter of the body. The liver is the detox mechanism that we have. A quick point I want to make is that there are all these really interesting detox diets, which to me make no sense whatsoever, because if your liver is functioning, you don't need any detox, especially when you see this stuff that says a liver detox. It's very convoluted. Unless your liver's failing, you don't need anything to detox your body, because guess what? You got your liver. But I'll make a video about that at some point. But I just want to mention that. So let's zoom into this picture. So we consume a drug or some kind of substance. It goes down into the stomach. In the stomach, we have a couple things going on. We got some acids. We have what are called the flora, the gut flora, or the gut bacteria, the good bacteria. And we have some enzymes, some stuff that breaks some things down. All of this stuff works together to help chew up that food, break it down, and move it through the body. Then it goes through the gastrointestinal tract. Here we have some bacteria, some more enzymes, And these bacteria are bacterial enzymes, and some of these enzymes are intestinal enzymes. Now, while all this is happening, we have this very complex system, these veins, these portals, by which stuff moves into the liver and then out into what's called general systemic circulation, or the circulation that moves through our body, but it's got to pass through the liver. It goes through this long biochemical process, oftentimes involving this thing called cytochrome P450. This thing that's really a main player in the metabolism of things, the breaking down of these substances, and especially things like psilocybin. So this whole process is geared to dramatically reduce the concentration of a substance so that the bare minimum is pushed through circulation in the body, because again, we don't need all of what we just consumed. This is the case for psilocybin, LSD, Tylenol, ibuprofen, all that stuff. So let's continue. So I mentioned the first pass. This will go on through the liver and the stomach, like I said. Now, about 20% turns into psilocin. And this is a 5-HT2A receptor agonist, aka it likes the 5-HT2A receptor. We talked about these 5-HT receptors. This is the receptor that when it connects, it will initiate that hallucinogenic, psychedelic, and altered sensory effects, and all sorts of other things. I mentioned earlier that most of it we don't need. So a little over 80%, about 80% is excreted through the urine as a bunch of metabolites, but mainly something called psilocin G. Then we have these things called monoamine oxidases. Now these structures will break down psilocin. It also breaks down neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. Because whenever the body is creating something, in order to keep that balance, it has to also break those things down. Because you don't want too much of, serotonin in your body, or, too much of a foreign substance like psilocybin or psilocin. So something I do want to mention are these things called monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Now, this is a class of antidepressants. These will keep monoamine oxidase from functioning properly. Well, why is that? Well, the idea behind depression is that it is an imbalance of these neurotransmitters. So you want to keep these neurotransmitters in circulation, so you're going to try to reduce the enzyme that will break these things down. Now, if a monoamine oxidase inhibitor is consumed, it will increase the systemic psilocin if it is consumed with magic mushrooms. And as I mentioned before, they are used in antidepressants. It is a class of antidepressants. I say this because if someone is on a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you should not do magic mushrooms. While it seems like these effects are very useful and they do have a lot of use in medicine, we'll talk about that soon, you really don't want more than you need. This could be dangerous. I just thought that was an important point to make. One other piece is that ayahuasca is composed of a bunch of different things. DMT, but it's also composed of natural monoamine oxidase inhibitors. I say that because I don't know how the native peoples found this out, but when you have a molecule like DMT, the tryptamine, and an MAOI, this marriage will produce a greater systemic DMT, resulting in a greater psychedelic experience. This is a fascinating point because it's interesting to me that this psychedelic brew has the components for an optimal experience. I don't know how they figured this out, but they managed to understand in some ways the chemistry involved that would dramatically increase the already potent DMT molecule. So let's continue. This is just a little simple diagram I wanted to show I found on the internet just to kind of give you guys a visual of what's happening. So we have psilocybin here, and it goes through this first pass metabolism, gets converted into psilocin, right? So we're talking about a reduction, about 20%, 80% in urine, as we mentioned. This will connect with these 5-HT2A receptors. As I mentioned, 5-HT is a category. We got 2A, 2C, 1A, there's 1B, there's a bunch of different ones. This will go on to produce all sorts of responses in the cells. Here, decrease anxiety, depression, and mood disorders, anxiety disorders, a decrease in those symptoms, and all sorts of other more complex responses, namely the potent psychedelic experience. In these 5-HT receptors, I mentioned 5-HT is another word for serotonin. These are the serotonin receptors. All sorts of other stuff will interact with these things, like mescaline and MDMA and things like that. Let's briefly discuss some stigma. So we got our boy right here, Nixon. Now, why am I talking about Nixon? Well, as many of us know, in the 1960s, the war on drugs started. This was a pretty big part of the Nixon campaign. While I don't want to blame Nixon, I think that from my research, some of his thoughts were well-meaning. I do think, though, that this war on drugs has been a failure. And we can talk about this forever and ever. But the whole purpose of this initiative, in my opinion, did more harm than good. But specifically, this U.S. Controlled Substances Act was passed. This is where we get the scheduling for drugs. Psilocybin is known as a Schedule 1. Schedule 1 substances have no accepted medical use, and they have a high potential for abuse. So here's where I have an issue. I feel the same way about cannabis, but magic mushrooms specifically. For the next couple slides, and in part 3 of this series, we're going to talk about the medical use. The idea that these things have no accepted medical use is pretty much false. The idea that these substances have a high potential for abuse is pretty much false. It makes no sense that these mushrooms are Schedule 1. Some people will say, and I sort of agree, that Nixon, being a very vindictive person, decided to lash out at some of the hippies, quote-unquote hippies, that oppose the Vietnam War, and in his pettiness decided, I'm going to throw some of these substances in Schedule 1 so they're completely banned. The issue with this stigma, with the stigma that surrounds these substances, is that while there are risks with this and other psychedelics, there are over-sweeping generalizations. Much of this started with LSD. It was heavily used, and the people in power were like, no, we can't have that. If you pause and think to yourself, what do I think about magic mushrooms? If you've never used mushrooms or never looked into it, what's going to come to your mind most likely are false impressions of what these things are and what they do. Most people are familiar with them from movies and media and sensationalist thinking that maybe the people that use these go crazy or they're wild. Many people think that those who use psychedelics are unstable. Overall, there's a very negative connotation to the use of substances like psilocybin. But the main question, and this is a question that I present with most of my videos, is what does the data say? It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter what person A tells you or person B tells you. Is there data backing up these wild and crazy generalizations and stigma? So let's look into some of this data. I mentioned in part 3, we're going to do the whole part on all kinds of data. But as I close, I want to show you guys why this scheduling makes no sense for psilocybin. But most importantly, some of the very unique advances in psychiatric treatment with these mushrooms. Major depressive disorder, we say MDD for short, affects millions of Americans. Johns Hopkins University has a very cool Center for Psychedelics Research and Consciousness Research. And this is where I'm getting some of these papers. If you want to go on their website, they are doing some amazing amazing work in breaking down the stigma and really showing us how useful these mushrooms are. So they wanted to do a little study, and a lot of these studies are small, but they're noteworthy. This specific one had about 24 people, not a whole lot, but I'm going to show you guys some of the promising evidence, even though it's small, of the effect that these compounds have. Now, these were divided into two groups. The first group, A, waited about 8 weeks to get the mushrooms. Group B was immediate. Regardless of the group, they got 2 doses, 2 weeks apart. The first one was 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms. The second one was 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms. They did a follow-up 1 day, 1 week, 1, 3, 6, and 12 months after the treatment. Now, they did a bunch of different things to measure the effectiveness, but what they did use is the GRID HAM-D score. The HAM-D is it's a standard scale for measuring depression. So let's look at some of these numbers. So the mean average pre-treatment baseline HAM-D was about 22.8. The higher the score, the more the depression. After 1 week, the average was 8.7. After 4 weeks, the average was about 8.8. After about 3 months, the average was 9.3. After about 6 months, the average was 7.0. And 12 months, the average was about 7.7. So what does this mean? Well, even though it was a small amount of people, and some of the situations were a little different, we're seeing here a dramatic reduction in this score from an average of about 22.8 to 8.7, 8.8. Regardless, this measure of depression dropped for almost all of the participants. I mentioned this is a very small study. The numbers aren't perfect, but we're seeing here some evidence of something happening. Now, we can't make a claim just on this data, but something's going on that's very useful and noteworthy. Let's talk about one more study. Another study that was done was on cancer patients. Now, this was cancer-related anxiety and depression, specifically with people who were terminal. An unfortunate reality is that when people are diagnosed with terminal cancer, they're all of a sudden faced with death, a reality that they probably were not expecting. And this can bring heavy levels of anxiety and angst about dying and depression. Looked at about 51 people. Here's the question: can the changes healthy individuals experience be replicated in these patients? We know that, so these two studies are some of many. There have been so many studies on psilocybin. We know, though, that healthy individuals can undergo some relatively dramatic changes in their anxiety, depression, and just in general, their life. Even if you're not depressed, people use these substances and really experience a profound and oftentimes lingering change. Can these changes be the same in people with cancer? So these patients had anxiety and depression diagnoses, and here's how they did it. And there's a lot more pieces to the study, but this is kind of just the gist. There were 2 treatment sessions, about 5 weeks apart. Now, the first treatment was 1 to 3 milligrams per 70 kilograms, which is not really a lot, a very small amount. The second was a lot higher, 22 to 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms. According to the study, that's a medium to high dose. Then some questions were asked. Now, there's a bunch of questionnaires that were done. Many of these were quality of life. Now, these were asked beforehand and after. Quality of life, acceptance of death, optimism, And then you had depression. They used like the HAM-D and things like that, and others. Because what they wanted to do, they wanted to see, okay, how does this patient feel before this treatment, and how do they feel afterwards? That's it. They saw an 80% reduction in depression and anxiety at the 6-month follow-up. That's significant. Even though it's 51 people, that's an 80% reduction. As I mentioned, these are some of the many examples of the effectiveness of magic mushrooms. So I say again, the idea that these things are Schedule 1 makes no sense by definition of what Schedule 1 is. So let's go through the summary and review what we learned. We first talked about how these mushrooms belong to a genus called the psilocybes. The magic comes from things like psilocybin, psilocin, that brings the psychedelic effect. They've been used for a long, long time throughout human history, especially places like Mexico, Central and South America. The compounds that make psilocybin magic are part of the tryptamines. Serotonin belongs to this family, melatonin, LSD, DMT. It's a very interesting and complex family, some of which are psychedelic, some of which are not. But they all belong to the same family unit with very similar structures. Then we talked about psilocybin as a prodrug, a substance that turns into the active form when it's metabolized in the body. Talked about how psilocybin, when it's converted in the stomach, specifically the liver, turns into the active ingredient psilocin, much like codeine and heroin will turn into morphine. The main point here being that psilocybin itself is the inactive version, and psilocin is the active version. Then we spoke a little bit about this first pass effect, where psilocybin gets broken down, turned into psilocin. We also mentioned how psilocin and serotonin are very similar in their structure. They in fact bind to the same receptors. We mentioned that the structure of compounds oftentimes dictates their function, and that's the case here, along with many other situations and compounds. The main purpose of first pass metabolism being to take a substance from a high concentration and bring it to a low concentration, because your body doesn't need all of that stuff. This is the same process that ibuprofen goes through, as well as the compound of this discussion, psilocybin. We also mentioned that the liver, being the great filter, is the most important piece in this situation. When psilocybin goes through this first pass effect, 20% turns into that active ingredient, 80% gets converted into this other ingredient that's excreted through the urine. That 20% will connect to that 5-HT2A receptor. We have these compounds, these monoamine oxidases that break down psilocin and neurotransmitters. And we briefly mentioned these monoamine oxidase inhibitors that do increase the systemic psilocin, neurotransmitters, etc. And we briefly talked about how ayahuasca, the genius of this brew, involves monoamine oxidase inhibitors as well as the principal ingredient, DMT. Then we briefly discussed some simple mechanics, a nice flow chart to show you guys how this process works. We talked about the stigma surrounding these substances and others, this war on drugs that Nixon started, the U.S. Controlled Substances Act, the ridiculous scheduling of magic mushrooms. We know that many of us have these generalizations of this substance, but the question we wanted to answer is, what does the data say? We want to listen to data, not propaganda. We spoke about a very small study, 24 people involved, that had major depressive disorder. Although there was a small amount of people, we saw a dramatic reduction in the depression scores after their doses in the follow-up period, showing that this compound does have some very real promise as a treatment of major depressive disorder. Then we closed out with another study involving cancer-related anxiety and depression, 51 people, showing an 80% reduction in depression and anxiety at a 6-month follow-up. Something else I didn't mention is that throughout this process here, you had someone sitting with the person, coaching them through some things, helping them connect with their experience. Overall, these patients saw a greater acceptance of death, a greater optimism about what was to come, and just an overall calmness, less angst, less sadness. And this seems to really help those who are dying. I know that if I had a family member that was dying, or if you had a family member that was dying, if it was inevitable, it would be ideal that they died peacefully and they died accepting that this was going to happen. And for me, this is a very, very important piece. And I think it's something that will help many, many people face this existential quagmire they might find themselves in. So that's all I got. I hope you guys learned a little something new. This is a redo of a series I tried to start like a year and some change ago. So I figured let me just restart it. I'm really excited for these next 2 parts, so please stick around as we learn a little bit more about these very interesting mushrooms. So let's break some of this stigma and try to figure out what's really going on. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.